There's something about Pokemon that lives in the back of your mind long after the screen goes dark. A melody you can't shake. A town that felt wrong. A question that the game never answered. That pull that I got, that quiet, gnawing sense that the world of Pokemon is larger and stranger than anyone ever told you. That's what we're here for tonight. Settle in. Get comfortable. We're going to walk slowly through some of the deepest, strangest, and most genuinely unresolved corners of the Pokemon universe. The mysteries that kept you up as a kid. The ones that still don't have answers. The lore so dark it catches you off guard when you remember you found it in a children's game. We'll take our time with each one. No rush. Just the quiet hum of a world that holds more secrets than it will ever fully give up. There's something particular about the way Pokemon hides its strangeness. The games are bright. The music is cheerful. The starter Pokemon are round and friendly, and the first town you begin in is always warm and small and safe. And then, gradually, the world reveals itself to be something more complicated. A game mechanic turns out to have a philosophical implication. A Pokédex entry contains a sentence that doesn't belong in a children's encyclopedia. A location appears that doesn't fit the emotional register of everything around it. The franchise has been doing this since 1996, building a surface that is genuinely, straightforwardly fun and accessible, and underneath it, layer by layer, a different world. One that rewards patience and attention and the willingness to sit with a question that has no easy answer. That's what we're here for. The questions without easy answers. The places where the map goes strange and the music changes and something that looked like adventure starts to feel like something else. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is. It always blows my mind how far this channel reaches. Whether it's 3 in the afternoon on a rainy Tuesday or 2 in the morning with your phone face down beside you, I see you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. This is the kind of content that takes a while to put together, and every subscriber genuinely helps keep it going. Now, let's go to Lavender Town. Section 1. The town that something is wrong with. There's a moment in Pokemon Red and Blue, and if you played those games, you know exactly what moment this is, where the music changes. You've spent hours up to this point moving through the brightness of Pallet Town, the cheerful bustle of Cerulean City, the crackling energy of Vermilion. The world has been warm and open, full of tall grass and wide skies, and the feeling that anything could be hiding just around the next corner. And then you walk through a narrow pass and the palette shifts. The colors go gray. The music drops away and is replaced by something else entirely. Lavender Town. The theme that plays when you enter Lavender Town in the original Japanese Pokemon Red and Green, released on February 27th, 1996, is unlike anything else in those games. While most of the soundtrack bounces with the cheerful optimism of adventure, the Lavender Town theme is built around something uncomfortable. It uses sharp chiptune tones arranged in a deliberately dissonant way. Chords that don't quite resolve, that circle around unease without ever releasing it. The composer was Junichi Masuda, and what he created is arguably the most famous piece of video game music ever made. Not because of its melody, but because of what people began to believe about it. The town itself earns the music. Lavender Town is small. Smaller than anywhere else in the Kanto region. It has no gym. It has no major shops. It exists, seemingly, for one purpose: to house the Pokemon Tower, a 7-story building that serves as the burial ground for deceased Pokemon. This is the place where trainers come to mourn, where the ghosts of Pokemon who have died wander the halls. Where, on the 6th floor, a ghost blocks your path, a ghost that your Pokédex cannot identify, that no Pokéball can catch, that simply stands there in the dark and watches you. When you finally obtain the Sylph Scope in return, you learn what that ghost is. It's a Marowak, a mother. She was killed by Team Rocket while trying to protect her Cubone from being captured and sold. Her skull was taken. And now she remains on the 6th floor of a tower full of graves, not quite able to move on, not quite able to leave the place where her child last needed her. That's the canon. That's what the game tells you. But people began to feel very early on that Lavender Town was hiding something more. The Lavender Town Syndrome is what they called it. The story, which began circulating around 2010 on forums and paste sites, claimed that in the days following the original Japanese release of Pokemon Red and Green, there was a spike in unexplained suicides and illnesses among children between the ages of 7 and 12. According to the most widely shared version of the story, hundreds of children who reached Lavender Town in the game began experiencing severe headaches, irrational behavior, and in the most extreme tellings, they took their own lives. The cause, the story claimed, was the Lavender Town theme itself, specifically a range of high-frequency tones embedded in the music that only children could hear, sounds calibrated precisely to cause distress in young listeners. The developers, discovering what had happened, quietly altered the theme before the international release. The original tone was lower, faster, and noticeably different from the version that made it to the West. And that difference, like that verifiable, documented fact that the music was changed, gave the story just enough of a foothold in reality to take on a life of its own. It spread the way only things that touch the right nerve can spread. By 2012, searches for Lavender Town Syndrome were peaking worldwide. YouTube videos emerged claiming to show spectrograms of the original Japanese theme, visual representations of the audio that appeared to contain hidden images. A ghost. Letters spelling out phrases like, "Get out and leave now." Some of these videos claim that the unknown alphabet, which wouldn't be introduced to the games until Pokemon Gold and Silver in 1999, was somehow visible in the audio waves of a 1996 track, which would have been impossible. Except the unknown look like ancient symbols. And who's to say what ancient symbols look like? The truth, which is worth stating clearly, is that none of the Lavender Town Syndrome story is real. There are no records, none, of a spike in child suicides in Japan in February 1996. No hospital admissions, no media coverage, no government response. An event of that scale affecting hundreds of children would have been impossible to suppress. Japan has a free press. Parents talk. Teachers notice. The story did not happen. And yet, the music was changed. That much is confirmed. The original Japanese version of the Lavender Town theme does use higher-pitched tones than the international version. This was almost certainly done for practical reasons. The Game Boy speaker was a tiny, tinny thing, and what sounds fine in a recording studio can become genuinely unpleasant through certain hardware. Making adjustments for international audiences was standard localization practice, but the fact that it was changed became the story's anchor. Something was altered. Something was quieted. And in the absence of a clear explanation from Nintendo or Game Freak about why the change was made, speculation flooded in to fill the silence. There's a reason this particular legend found purchase when others didn't. Researchers who have studied the Lavender Town Syndrome phenomenon have noted that it arrived precisely as the first wave of Pokemon fans was growing up. Children who had played those original games were in their early 20s when the story went viral. They had spent years with those games. They knew every route, every trainer, every cave. And Lavender Town was the one place in that bright, hopeful world that had always felt wrong. They had felt it as children without being able to name it. And when someone gave them a name for it, when someone said yes, something actually was wrong with that town, something real happened there, something was hidden from you, there was a part of them that almost wanted it to be true. Not because they wanted children to have suffered, but because it would have meant their instincts were right. That the discomfort they felt at 7 years old, alone in their bedroom at night, with a gray screen and a strange melody, was a response to something genuine. The game also doesn't help itself by being genuinely strange in that location. Lavender Town contains a man who will not give you his name, referred to only as Mr. Fuji, who turns out to have been involved in the creation of Mewtwo. There is a ghost on the 6th floor that cannot be caught or identified by any normal means. The Pokédex entries for the ghost-type Pokémon found there read in ways that feel like they're gesturing at something the game isn't fully willing to say. And at the very top of the tower, after you've battled your way past possessed trainers and floating skulls, there's a man being held hostage by Team Rocket who thanks you quietly and gives you a poke flute that plays a lullaby. The whole sequence has a weight to it that most of the rest of the game doesn't carry. Then there's the matter of the 3 additional elements that grew up around the Lavender Town legend. The first is the White Hand, a sprite supposedly hidden in the game's one, a pale, decaying hand that would appear to players in the Pokemon Tower and, according to the legend, cause physical illness in those who saw it. The second is the Buried Alive model, a half-buried zombie described as a scrapped final challenge for the tower. A boss encounter that was removed from the game at the last moment for reasons never officially explained. And the third is a ghost animation, supposedly programmed to appear to players under specific conditions and then erased from the code before the game shipped. None of these have been verified through actual data mining of the original cartridges. People have gone looking. They've combed through the ROM data. They haven't found a White Hand sprite lurking in the tower. They haven't found the Buried Alive boss. The game's code is not a completely sealed archive, however. Lavender Town contains placeholders, sprites, and ghost tile data that researchers have dug up over the years. Fragments of incomplete programming that look, in certain lights, like the beginning of something that was never finished. Was the tower meant to have more? Were there encounters or events that were cut before release? Almost certainly something was changed. Games are always different in their final weeks of development than anyone planned. But whether those changes were the monstrous things the legend describes, or simply ordinary development adjustments, is impossible to say for certain. What's fascinating from a cultural standpoint is what the Lavender Town Syndrome tells us about the relationship between a generation and their childhood media. The story is essentially an act of myth-making, a community of adults reaching back into their shared experience and weaving a narrative that gives the unsettled feelings of childhood a shape and a cause. It's a very human thing to do. When something troubles us and we can't explain it, we explain it. The Lavender Town theme troubled millions of children. No one told them why. And so years later, when the internet gave them each other, they built a reason. The actual history of Lavender Town. The history of a small, deliberately haunting corner of a children's game that contains a genuine ghost story about a murdered mother and her orphaned child, is in some ways more affecting than the legend that grew up around it. But that's the strange nature of mystery. The real story and the invented story have existed side by side for so long that they've become impossible to fully separate. Ask someone what Lavender Town means to them, and they'll describe both at once, without even realizing they're doing it. The music plays on. And maybe that's the most telling thing about the whole phenomenon. After everything, after the debunking, after the explanations, after 30 years of the actual story being available to anyone who wants it, the Lavender Town theme is still the one piece of video game music that a significant portion of the population identifies as genuinely unsettling. Not because of what it did, not because of children who died or frequencies that caused harm, but because it did exactly what it was designed to do. Junichi Masuda composed a piece of music meant to communicate grief and unease in a world where most of the music communicated adventure and joy. He succeeded more thoroughly than anyone anticipated. The myth grew around the success. The story of Lavender Town Syndrome is, in a sense, a compliment taken to absurd extremes. The community's way of saying, yes, this music worked. It worked so well that we had to explain it as something supernatural because nothing ordinary could have made us feel this particular way. What's left unresolved, though, is not the safety of the music. What's unresolved is the deeper question about Lavender Town itself, about what the game was actually saying when it placed a graveyard at the center of a children's adventure. Pokemon are captured. They are kept in boxes. They fight battles that sometimes push them to the edge of consciousness. And then they die, and someone buries them in a 7-story tower, and a mother's ghost guards the stairs because she couldn't protect her child when it mattered. The game introduced this without editorial comment, without content warnings, without softening. You find Lavender Town because the story sends you there, and then you find out what it is. Maybe that's what the myth was always really about. Not the music, the realization. Section 2, Mew under the truck, and the mystery Pokemon who was never meant to be found. Before we go further, it's worth understanding something about the culture surrounding Pokemon Red and Blue in 1996 and 1997. The internet, as a household resource, barely existed. In Japan, a handful of enthusiasts were online. In America, where the games arrived in September 1998, a few more people had dial-up connections. But real-time information sharing was still a novelty. The way information moved was the way it had always moved. Person to person, on the playground, in school corridors, passed in handwritten notes and breathlessly relayed during lunch breaks. This matters because it created the perfect environment for mythology. When something impossible seeming happened in a video game, a strange encounter, a glitch, an unexplained sprite, there was no quick way to look it up and confirm or deny it. You either believed the person telling you, or you went home and tried it yourself, spending hours in pursuit of something that may or may not have been real. And in that space between hearing and verifying, legends were born. The most enduring Pokemon legend from those early years is about a truck. A very specific truck. And a very specific, very elusive Pokemon. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, there exists a small section of Vermilion City that is, under almost all normal circumstances, completely inaccessible. Near the dock where the SS Anne is moored, the cruise ship where you battle your rival and obtain the HM cut, there is a ledge of water that the ship blocks. Once you have cut and leave the ship, the SS, Anne sails away, and the ledge becomes visible but unreachable. If, however, you manage to reach it through unconventional means, by deliberately losing a battle on the ship before it departs while already having taught surf to a Pokemon, or by trading a surfing Pokemon over from another game, you can actually make it to this ledge. And on that ledge, there is a truck. Just one. Sitting there inexplicably in a location no player was ever meant to reach, serving no purpose in the game's design. The truck is just there. And that inexplicable presence, a vehicle that exists for no discernible reason in a hidden corner of the map, was all the kindling the legend needed. The rumor spread as fast as any schoolyard rumor ever did. Mew, the mythical 151st Pokemon, the one that wasn't in the Pokedex, the one that almost no one had and everyone wanted, was hidden underneath that truck. All you had to do was find a way to get to it and then use the move strength to push the truck aside. And there Mew would be, waiting. Thousands of children tried. Some of them went to enormous lengths to try, restarting their entire games, carefully working out the complex series of steps needed to access the ledge with a surfer before the ship left. They pushed the truck. They tried every angle. Nothing happened. The truck, for what it's worth, is almost certainly just a remnant of development. Games of that era often had assets placed in areas that weren't properly cleared during the final stages of production. A truck sprite that was used somewhere, moved, and then accidentally left in a corner of the map where no one expected anyone to ever look. No mystery, no intention, just the ordinary messiness of making a piece of software. But the reason the Mew rumor felt plausible, the reason it caught hold as firmly as it did, is that Mew genuinely was in the game and genuinely could be encountered through means that sounded exactly as unlikely as a secret truck. The legendary trainer fly glitch, now well known among speedrunners and glitch hunters, allows a player to manipulate the game's battle encounter data by escaping from a trainer the moment they spot you, then flying to another location before their battle music fully triggers. When you next encounter a wild Pokemon, the game, still carrying the encounter data from that aborted trainer battle, uses the special stat of the trainer's first Pokemon to determine what wild Pokemon you'll face. With the right trainer, at the right moment, that special stat resolves to Mew, a level 7 Mew, wild, catchable, real. This glitch was not widely understood in 1996. People who stumbled into it didn't know why it worked. All they knew was that they had somehow found Mew in a way that seemed impossible, that seemed like it required a precise and almost arbitrary sequence of actions. And when they told their friends, the story became one of many methods: pushing trucks, talking to certain NPCs in a specific order, visiting locations at particular times that were said to produce the same result. The actual origin of Mew in the games is its own story. Shigeki Morimoto, a programmer at Game Freak, has spoken about adding Mew to the game in the final weeks of development, after the game was considered essentially complete. There was a single block of free memory remaining in the code, enough space for one more Pokemon. Morimoto, working late nights without the knowledge of his supervisors, quietly built Mew into that space. He gave it a sprite, a cry, a moveset, and statistics. He placed no legitimate way to obtain it in the game. His plan, apparently, was for Mew to exist as a kind of secret reward, something that might be distributed at events or through future updates. What's particularly remarkable about this is the degree of informality involved in what would become one of the most culturally significant decisions in the franchise's history. The most mythologized Pokemon. The creature that would anchor the plot of the franchise's first theatrical film. That would become the subject of the most enduring playground legend in gaming history. That would shape a generation's understanding of what a Pokemon game could contain, was added to the code by one person, working alone, in spare memory, without official sanction. If Morimoto hadn't decided to use that last free block, Mew would not exist. The mystery would not have existed. The playground rumors would not have existed. The truck would have remained just an inexplicable development artifact in an inaccessible corner of Vermilion City, never mythologized, never acknowledged with Easter eggs, never remembered. The entire edifice of Mew mythology rests on one programmer's late-night decision to use 300 bytes of available memory. When the game shipped and players began discovering Mew through glitches and code exploits, it created what the Columbia Business School later cited as a critical driver of the franchise's extraordinary early growth. The mystique around Mew, the sense that something was hidden, that the game contained a secret larger than itself, was a powerful force. People bought copies hoping to find it. People traded rumors and strategies. The gaming press began covering it. Nintendo held events where players could have Mew legitimately added to their cartridges. In Japan, a giveaway in the Koro Comics magazine attracted roughly 78,000 entries for 20 prizes. Mew made Pokemon more than a game. It made it a mystery. And mysteries attract devotion in a way that completed puzzles simply cannot. The truck itself became a lasting piece of the mythology. Nintendo and Game Freak never forgot it. In Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the remakes of the original games released in 2004, they placed a lava cookie on the ground near that same truck. A small gift hidden in the same inaccessible corner. Acknowledging the legend. A wink across 8 years of franchise history. In the Pokemon Let's Go games, released in 2018, there's a revive item tucked under the truck for those who find their way there. The location has, through the accumulation of these small acknowledgments, become a kind of a sacred site. The place where the myth lived, marked by the people who made the thing that spawned the myth. There were other rumors in those early years. Peekaboo was perhaps the second most famous, a small, round, blue creature that players began spotting in promotional material and anime footage before the second generation of games was officially announced. In the anime, a small blue Pokemon with rounded ears and a ball at the end of its tail appeared briefly in the background of certain shots, and no one knew what it was. The rumor on playgrounds across the world was that Peekaboo, as everyone called it, was a secret Pokemon hidden in Pokemon Red and Blue, accessible through some undiscovered method. Kids developed elaborate theories about how to obtain it. The answer, when it finally came, was mundane. The creature was Marill, a water type introduced in the next generation of games that had appeared in the anime before the games were released. But Marill being Marill didn't land with any particular satisfaction. A thing so sought after, with a name so thoroughly believed in, felt cheapened by a real explanation. This is perhaps the deepest truth about the Mew mythology, and the truck, and all the playground rumors of that era. The answer, when it comes, is rarely as satisfying as the question. Mew was in a hidden piece of memory. The truck was a development leftover. Peekaboo was just Marill, and yet the feeling those mysteries created, the sense that the game was larger than it appeared, that something extraordinary was waiting just beyond what you could see. That feeling was not a deception. It was a genuine invitation into a world that rewarded curiosity. The rewards just didn't always look like what you expected. Some of those questions, though, never fully resolved. The truck sits in its inaccessible corner to this day, surrounded by official Easter eggs and decades of accumulated lore, and it's still not entirely clear why it was put there in the first place. The original programmers who made that specific map have never, to anyone's knowledge, specifically addressed the truck. Its presence remains unexplained in any official capacity, which means that in some technical sense the mystery is still open. Not because Mew is under it, but because no one has ever said with certainty why a truck is on a ledge that no one was ever supposed to reach. There's a broader lesson here that the Mew mythology illuminates about the nature of mystery and belief. The story of Mew under the truck is, at its heart, a story about wanting to believe in hidden things. Children who played those games were encountering something larger than themselves. A world that seemed genuinely limitless. A system with enough complexity that surprising things emerged from it without warning. And into that space of genuine wonder, the truck stepped as a kind of symbol, an inexplicable thing in a location you weren't supposed to reach. A placeholder for all the other inexplicable things you sense might be hiding in the world. The fact that the truck was just a leftover asset doesn't diminish the feeling that led people to believe it mattered. That feeling was correct. The game was full of hidden things. Missing number was real. The Trainer Fly Mew glitch was real. Events and encounters that most players never found were hidden throughout the game's code. The instinct that there was more beneath the surface was a sound one. The truck was just the wrong location for it. And Game Freak, by placing those Easter eggs near it in later games, the lava cookie, the revive, the small acknowledgments of the legend, implicitly validated the instinct even while correcting the specific belief. Yes, they seem to say, you were right to look here. There is something here. We put it here for you. Not because the truck matters, but because the looking matters. Because the children who surfed past a departing ship on the strength of a friend's whispered rumor were doing exactly what the game was designed to inspire. Curiosity. The willingness to try something that sounded impossible. That was always what Pokemon was for. Section 3. Missing No. The thing that should not exist, and kind of does, of all the mysteries that have emerged from 30 years of Pokemon, Missing No is the one that crossed completely out of the games and into the broader culture. It appeared on lists of the greatest video game moments of all time. It was referenced in academic papers about the nature of video game glitches and how players relate to unintended content. It was covered in Nintendo Power, in gaming magazines worldwide, in casual conversation among people who had never played a video game in their lives, but had somehow heard of the scrambled, backward L-shaped thing that lived in Pokemon and could give you 99 Master Balls. The name stands for Missing Number, which is exactly what it is. A placeholder in the game's data structure for Pokemon that doesn't exist. Here is the technical reality, stated as simply as it can be. The first generation of Pokemon games was built on an architecture that could theoretically reference up to 256 different creatures. The programmers only defined 151. That left 105 undefined slots in the data. Most of those slots, when referenced accidentally, produce pure garbage. The game tries to read Pokemon data and finds code meant for something else entirely, rendering as scrambled sprites and nonsensical behaviors. But 39 of those undefined slots have the name Missing Number assigned to them. They're placeholders, reserved spaces. The game knows those slots exist, knows there's nothing in them, and gives them a name that amounts to an internal note saying, "This is a missing number in the sequence." The most common form of missing number touchdown. The one encountered through what became known as the Old Man trick appears as a backward capital L made of glitching pixels. It has a type listed as bird/normal, where bird is a classification that never officially made it into the released game, likely a precursor to the flying type. It knows moves. It can be caught. It has a level and statistics. And when you encounter it, the sixth item in your inventory has its quantity increased by 128, which created the infamous duplication exploit that players used to give themselves stacks of rare candies and Master Balls. The Old Man trick works because of a specific interaction between two unrelated systems in the game's code. In Viridian City, an old man shows you a tutorial on how to catch a Pokemon. During this animation, the game needs to replace your character's name with Old Man as a display variable. It stores your actual character name in a section of memory normally used to hold encounter data for wild battles. When the animation ends, the game typically resets this memory. But if you immediately fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along the eastern coast, a section of map where the encounter tables were never properly defined because no one expected a player to surf there, the battle system activates and looks for encounter data. It finds the leftover character name data instead. It uses the letters of your character's name to determine what Pokemon to generate. If your name contains certain characters, those characters correspond to the index numbers of real Pokemon. If they correspond to undefined index numbers, you get Missing No. The entire thing is an accident. Two completely unconnected pieces of code interacting in a way no one intended because of a memory management oversight. The result is a thing that has a sprite made of garbage data, a cry that is either silence or a borrowed sound from another creature, and statistics that technically belong to nothing. And yet, data miners who have spent years combing through the original game's ROM have found something interesting. 9 of the 39 missing number slots have unique, distinct cry data. Sounds that are not borrowed from existing Pokemon, not silence, not garbage, but actual audio recordings that don't match anything in the release game. These 9 cries are not placeholder noise. They were deliberately placed there. They are apparently the sounds of Pokemon that were designed during development and then removed before the final game shipped. The internal ordering of the Pokemon Index also suggests something. Within the sequence of defined Pokemon, there are two missing Noino, slots placed between what appear to be related evolution families, in positions that would naturally be occupied by middle evolutions or related species. Researchers examining these positions believe they represent Pokemon that were designed, placed in the development sequence, alongside their evolutionary relatives, and then cut. Not abandoned during early concept stages, but removed after they've been given a place in the lineup. Some of those lost designs have since been identified through development leaks and materials that surfaced over the years. Creatures called Kotura and Raitura, an electric tiger line that apparently sat in early builds of the game before being removed. A design called Omega, occupying a slot close to where Mew ended up, that some researchers believe may have been a precursor to Mew itself before the final design was settled on. These aren't confirmed. They're reconstructions from fragmentary evidence, from index positions and borrowed cries, and the occasional scrap of artwork that has leaked out of Game Freak's archives over the decades. But they suggest something that Missing Number in its scrambled, impossible form has always hinted at. The Pokemon you played with in 1996 were the survivors of a much larger design process. For every Pikachu and Charizard that made it to the final game, there were dozens of creatures that didn't. Some were refined into the Pokemon we know. Some became the inspiration for later generations. And some simply ceased to exist in any form except as empty slots in a sequence, crying out in sounds that no one assigned to anything, waiting to be found by players who weren't supposed to be surfing on the coast of an island where the encounter tables were left undefined. Missing Number became famous partly because of the item duplication. That's the practical reason people sought it out. But it became a legend for a different reason. When people encountered it, that block of glitching pixels, that thing that shouldn't exist, they felt something. The game was presenting them with its own failure, its own incomplete edges. The world they'd been exploring, that bright, inviting, carefully constructed world, had a seam. And through the seam, you could see something that the world hadn't been designed to show you. Not Mew under a truck, not a secret level, just the raw underside of the thing you love. The place where it was built and where some of the building materials were left over and never cleaned up. Nintendo officially called Missing No a programming quirk and warned that encountering it might corrupt save files. The warning was technically accurate. Certain interactions with Missing Number and its cousin glitch Pokemon, particularly the one designated M00, could cause genuine damage to game data. But the warning also had the effect of making Missing Number feel dangerous, forbidden, like something you weren't meant to find, which is, of course, exactly how legends are born. There are entire online communities that have been studying the Generation 1 glitch ecosystem for decades now. They've categorized hundreds of distinct glitch entities, each with their own properties, their own index numbers, their own borrowed behaviors. They've traced the routes by which specific character names lead to specific encounters. They've discovered that certain glitch Pokemon, if encountered in specific ways, can teach moves to your party, or alter type charts, or cause the game to behave as if different Pokemon were registered in your Pokédex. The original Pokemon games are, in some sense, not a fixed object. They're a space that changes shape depending on how you interact with them. The rules that seem solid from the outside are soft at the edges, permeable, full of gaps where the game's own logic breaks down and something else comes through. Missing Number was the first thing most people ever found in those gaps. And 30 years later, people are still finding new things there. The academic world noticed, eventually. Sociologists and game studies scholars wrote papers about what Missing Number represented as a cultural phenomenon. One argument made in the research community was that Missing Number and the fan theories that attempted to make sense of it, to give it a place in the world, to explain its scrambled sprite as the ghost of a deleted Pokemon rather than simply a memory addressing error, revealed something specific about how players related to game worlds. There's a belief, the argument went, in the fundamental reality of the Pokemon who exist in those games as entities, beings with lives and histories and properties, rather than simply as code. When Missing Number appeared, players didn't think there is a data error in this system. They thought there is something here that was hidden, something that wasn't supposed to be seen, something that the world contains, even though the world didn't intend it. They brought a belief in the reality of the world's contents to an encounter with the world's structural failure. That belief, the belief that the game's creatures are real in some sense that transcends their data, is the belief that makes Pokemon work at all. You can't bond with a stat block. You can't feel something for a collection of bytes. But you can feel something for Pikachu, for Charizard, for the Cubone on the 6th floor of the Pokemon Tower, and Missing No is the visible seam where that belief meets the reality of what these things actually are. Not creatures, not beings. Indexed slots in a data structure, most of them, and 39 of them with no Pokemon assigned. The seam is where the mystery lives. Section 4. The Ditto Mew Theory. Failed clones, shared blood, and the question Game Freak never answered. There is a theory about two Pokemon that has circulated in the fandom for as long as the internet has existed. It is not an obscure theory. It is one of the most widely known and most frequently discussed ideas in all of Pokemon fandom. It has been addressed, obliquely, by at least one Game Freak employee. It has never been confirmed or definitively denied. And the evidence for it, the actual, verifiable, data-supported evidence, is strange enough that even the skeptics tend to hedge their rejections. The theory, Ditto is a failed clone of Mew. To understand why this theory has the staying power it does, you have to look at what Ditto and Mew share. Not the theories people have built around those similarities. The raw facts, the numbers, the documented characteristics of both Pokemon. They weigh the same. Both Mew and Ditto weigh exactly 8.8 pounds. In a franchise with hundreds of creatures ranging from a few ounces to hundreds of tons, two Pokemon sharing a precise weight is not remarkable by itself. But in combination with everything else, it begins to feel significant. Their base stats are distributed in an identical pattern. Both Mew and Ditto have perfectly balanced stat distributions, with every stat set at the same value. This is unusual. Most Pokemon have uneven distributions, high attack, low speed, or high special defense at the cost of physical defense. The perfectly flat distribution is a characteristic shared by almost nothing else in the entire franchise. Their color schemes mirror each other. Both are pink in their standard forms. Both turn blue when shiny. In a franchise where shiny forms are generated by specific data values within a Pokemon's individual characteristics, two creatures sharing the same standard and shiny color scheme is a deliberate choice, not a coincidence. They are both genderless, and they are both, in different ways, capable of taking on the characteristics of other Pokemon. Mew can learn every technical machine and hidden machine move in the game. Every single technique that any Pokemon can be taught. Ditto can transform into any Pokemon it encounters, copying their form, their moves, their typing, their stats. Both, in other words, contain within themselves the possibility of every other creature. Ditto is found in the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, the same location where the scientific journals detailing the creation of Mewtwo are hidden. The same building where researchers cloned Mew's DNA and created the most powerful Pokemon ever made. In the first generation of games, it's in the mansion and nowhere else in the Kanto region. It shares its habitat with the evidence of genetic experimentation, and Mew and Ditto are the only two Pokemon in the entire franchise who can legitimately learn Transform. The ability to become another Pokemon entirely. It appears in no other creature's natural move pool, It's a shared ability between two creatures who otherwise seem, on the surface, completely unrelated. The story, as the theory constructs it, goes like this. After discovering Mew in the jungles of what the original games described as Guyana, a team of scientists began attempting to clone it. Mewtwo was the goal, an amplified duplicate of the most genetically complete creature ever discovered. A weaponized perfection, but Mewtwo was not the first attempt. Before the scientists achieved the stability needed to produce Mewtwo, they made other attempts, clones that failed. Clones that retained Mew's transformative genetic potential, the ability to become other things, to hold the template of every creature within themselves, but lost the structure, the form, the coherent individuality that makes Mew what it is. Clones that became shapeless, that defaulted to a simple form, that could approximate anything but be nothing specific. Clones that were abandoned, left in the mansion, and that, over the generations since the scientists departed, spread out into the world. This would explain why Ditto appears everywhere in later games. If it began as a genetic experiment, its ability to breed with almost any Pokemon, another unique characteristic. Ditto is the universal breeding partner, capable of producing eggs with nearly every species in the franchise. Would mean it reproduced and diversified and spread far beyond the original site of its creation. A failed clone that became, paradoxically, one of the most reproductively successful Pokemon in existence. The one piece of official commentary that exists on this theory comes from Junichi Masuda, who worked as the composer for the original games, and who later became one of Game Freak's most prominent directors. In an interview that has circulated through the community, Masuda indicated that Ditto is not intended to be related to Mew. But several things complicate the statement. First, Masuda was the composer, not the lead programmer or designer, during the original development. His knowledge of design intent for specific Pokemon may be second-hand at best. Second, the interview in question is Japanese and has circulated primarily through translated summaries rather than fully verified transcripts. And third, even taking his statement at full face value, it speaks to intent, not to the possibility that the similarities were either intentional foreshadowing that was never followed up on, or an extraordinary coincidence that the franchise has simply never found a reason to address. What's particularly interesting is that the theory has never become canon, but it's also never been properly closed. Game Freak has, over 30 years of Pokemon lore, had countless opportunities to confirm or deny the connection explicitly. Through Pokédex entries, through in-game text, through the story of Pokemon Legends, Arceus, which explored early mythological history, through the various media that have touched on Mewtwo's creation in animated films and manga adaptations. They have never done so. The question remains, and it remains with exactly the kind of elegance that the best unsolved mysteries have. Not because the evidence is thin, but because the evidence is surprisingly strong, and the silence on the other side of it is total. There is one more piece of this. In the original game's programming, Missing Number, researchers noted something curious about the slot associated with Ditto in the development sequence. The arrangement of Pokemon in the internal index, the order in which they were evidently programmed, places Ditto in a position that suggests it was designed in close proximity to Mew, not adjacent, but nearby. In a sequence that otherwise groups related creatures together, Ditto and Mew are positioned in ways that, at minimum, suggest they were worked on around the same time, as part of the same design considerations. This is not proof of anything, it's a data point. But it's a data point that sits alongside all the others, and the accumulation is difficult to dismiss. The question of what Ditto really is in the deep lore of the Pokemon world, is one that the franchise has chosen to leave permanently open. Maybe that's the right choice. Some of the most powerful things in any mythology are the things left unnamed, But there's something worth sitting with about why this theory specifically has held its power for so long. It's not just that the evidence is unusual, it's that the theory, if true, changes the nature of something very familiar. Ditto is everywhere, it breeds with everything. It's used by players as a utility, a tool for producing eggs, for obtaining difficult Pokemon, for the mechanics of inheritance and breeding that underlie competitive play. Most players have owned dozens of Ditto over the course of their Pokemon careers, traded them, deposited them in boxes, caught more when the ones they had weren't optimal. Ditto, in the practical economy of Pokemon, is a resource. But the theory says this thing you've been using as a resource is the survivor of something. It is the thing that was tried and failed, that was discarded when a more successful version was achieved. It lives in the ruins of the place where it was made, the mansion where the experiments happened, now overgrown and abandoned. It has the same potential as the most powerful mythological creature in the franchise's first generation. And because that potential is distributed across thousands and thousands of identical bodies spread throughout the Pokemon world, the thing that was meant to be unique and powerful became common and overlooked. There is a story in that, if Game Freak ever decided to tell it, a story about failure and abundance, about the thing that didn't become what it was supposed to be and found a different kind of abundance in that failure. They haven't told it yet. The theory remains a theory. Ditto remains a utility, and the question remains. Section 5. The Ghost of Marowak and the Thing. The Pokemon Tower is really about. There is a moment in Pokemon Red and Blue that no one who played those games as a child ever fully forgets, even if they forgot almost everything else about them. You are standing in the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town. You've been battling your way up through possessed trainers and wild ghost-type Pokemon, moving through a building that is explicitly a cemetery, a place where the bodies of deceased Pokemon are interred. The tower is 7 stories tall, and the graves line every wall. People visit to pay respects. The whole structure is charged with a heaviness that the rest of the game rarely approaches. Before we go further, let me say something about the emotional architecture of that building. The Pokemon Tower is not incidentally a cemetery. It is specifically a cemetery. The gravestones you walk past have names on them, names of Pokemon. The trainers you battle inside are not gym trainers or criminals. They're people who came to grieve and have been possessed by the ghost types that live in the upper floors. Even the wild Pokemon encounters inside the tower feel different from encounters elsewhere in the game. You're not in tall grass, you're in a graveyard. The Pokemon you encounter there, the Ghastly, the Haunter, the Cubone wandering the halls, exist in a space defined by death. The game trusts you to understand this without explaining it. There's no text that says, this place is about grief. The architecture does the work. The music does the work. And the fact that you have to fight your way through the building, that the mechanic of Pokemon battling, which is the franchise's fundamental activity, its language of interaction, has to be applied in a space designed around mourning, creates an odd, unresolved tension. You are doing the thing you always do. You are doing it somewhere that makes that thing feel inadequate. Wrong, even. The tool you have is a battle. The thing you're facing is grief. These do not fit together, and the game makes no effort to paper over that dissonance. On the 6th floor, your path is blocked. Not by a trainer, not by a locked door, by a ghost. An entity that the game simply displays as Ghost, with no Pokedex number, no type listing, no information. Just a presence that will not let you pass. You can try to battle it. When you do, you receive a message that says you are too afraid to move. The ghost simply watches you, and your Pokemon are paralyzed with fear, and there is nothing you can do. You have to leave. You have to go to the Sylph Corporation, an entirely different part of the game, and complete a significant portion of the story to obtain an item called the Sylph Scope. Only then can you return. Only then does the scope reveal what has been standing between you and the top of the tower all along. It's a Marowak, level 30, female. And she will not enter a Pokeball. Every one you throw simply bounces off her, ineffective. The only thing you can do is defeat her in battle, and when you do, she is quiet for a moment. And then she disappears. Not into a ball, not captured. She simply goes. The town's dialogue tells you what happened. Team Rocket invaded the tower before the events of the game, hunting Cubone for their skulls, which were valuable commodities. One Cubone's mother, a Marowak, tried to stop them, tried to protect her child from being taken, and Team Rocket killed her. She's still there, on the 6th floor of the tower, where her child was nearly taken. Not able to leave. Not able to accept what happened. Blocking the stairs, not out of malice, but out of the residual force of a mother's inability to stop protecting, even after there is nothing left to protect. The Cubone is eventually found in Mr. Fuji's care at the top of the tower. It wears a skull on its head, the skull of its mother, as the Pokédex entry will tell you. And if you look at the canonical Pokédex entries for Cubone across the decades of games that followed, they return again and again to the same description. It weeps for the mother it will never see again. It holds the bone it fights with and cries at night. When it cries, the skull on its head sometimes slides down over its face and it can't see, and it cries harder, alone in the dark. This is presented to a child with no warning, as a fragment of story encountered partway through a game about collecting creatures and winning battles. The question that has never been fully answered, the question that turns this from a sad story into a genuine piece of unresolved lore, is about the skull itself. Every Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother. This is stated across multiple Pokédex entries in multiple games, across more than 20 years of the franchise. But if every Cubone's mother died before the Cubone could evolve, and if Cubone evolves into Marowak, then where are all the mothers coming from? Are there Marowak who simply survive long enough to have Cubone children and then die naturally? Does the Marowak in every region suffer the same fate? Some players have suggested that the Cubone's skull might not literally be from its individual mother, that the Pokédex entries are written by a 10-year-old protagonist who may be working from legend rather than documented fact. Others have proposed grimmer interpretations, that Cubone are born in a state of grief, that the skull is not removed from a specific mother, but is somehow generated by the process of becoming Cubone, that the lore is intentionally incomplete. None of these answers are satisfying, and the franchise has never provided a definitive one. There's also the matter of the Marowak on the 6th floor specifically. Several fans have noted over the years that her encounter is unusual in a technical sense. She's a wild Pokemon in that she appears in a wild battle encounter and not as a trainer's Pokemon. But she can't be caught. In a game fundamentally about catching Pokemon, encountering a Pokemon that explicitly cannot be caught is a pointed decision. The game won't let you add her to your party. You defeat her and she dissolves, and the only thing you get from the interaction is the ability to climb stairs. There is a theory that has quietly circulated for years about what the uncatchable Marowak represents in the context of Pokemon's philosophy. The games encourage players to think of Pokemon as partners, as companions, as beings that benefit from training and care. But the Marowak Ghost is a Pokemon who cannot be helped. She can't be caught. She can't be trained. She can't be put in the PC and retrieved later when you need her. The only thing you can do is free her from her current state by defeating her, but not. Which is to say, by making her lose a battle, which is the mechanism by which all Pokemon are weakened before they can be caught. Except that in her case, losing the battle means leaving rather than being captured. She won the battle of protection. She failed at survival. And the game offers no remedy for that failure except to acknowledge it and move on. In later games, specifically Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, the developers revisited this moment and added a new layer. In those games, defeating the ghost Marowak in battle isn't what brings her peace. Instead, the Cubone she protected appears. Trace, the player's rival in those games, has been traveling with a Cubone that evolved from the very child she died to save. And when the Cubone sees its mother, the ghost quiets without a fight. The Marowak simply sees that her child is safe, that her child is loved, that her child has grown, and she goes. That change, the decision to let the resolution come from reunion rather than defeat, says something about how the franchise's relationship with this story deepened over the decades. The original game, with its limited storytelling tools, could only give you the defeat. The later game, with 30 years of experience in telling stories about bonds between Pokemon and humans, gave you the ending the story actually wanted. But the questions about Cubone's skull, about the mechanics of how every Cubone is orphaned, about the taxonomy of grief that runs through the entire line, those remain open. And the Marowak, who stands on the 6th floor of a 7-story building full of graves, who you can only reach by obtaining a special scope, who you cannot catch and cannot truly help, she remains one of the strangest and most genuinely moving things the franchise ever created. A story about a mother in a game made for children. A ghost story in which the ghost is sympathetic. A mystery wrapped in a tragedy, wrapped in a mechanic. The skull on every Cubone's head is her answer to the question of what happened. But the question of why it had to happen, why every Cubone, remains. And there's one more thread to pull in the Marowak story that doesn't often get attention. The Pokédex entry for Marowak herself, for the fully evolved form of the line, the creature the ghost was in life, describes her as having overcome the grief of losing her child. This is the standard Marowak, not the ghost. The narrative the Pokédex constructs for the species is that Marowak grows stronger through loss. That the grief, which defines Cubone so completely, is what Marowak transcends in order to become the powerful, focused creature she eventually is. The skull it carries is no longer just a symbol of what was lost. It's a weapon. The grief became strength. This is a genuinely unusual thing to put in a Pokédex. Most entries describe physical traits or hunting behaviors or interesting facts about habitat. The Marowak line's entries are a through line of psychological development, moving from an infant defined entirely by its grief to an adult who transformed that grief into something harder. It's a portrait of a kind of maturation that the game never explicitly names as such. And then the ghost in the tower is the version of that journey interrupted. The mother who didn't survive to transform her grief, who is still in the early stage, the Cuban stage, in a way, defined entirely by what was lost, unable to move forward, waiting on a staircase that leads nowhere she can follow. The question the games leave unanswered is whether the ghost knows that her child grew up, whether she knows that the bones her Cubone wore were put to use, whether the grief that kept her on that floor was, in some sense, the same impulse that eventually made her child strong. In the Let's Go games, when the Cubone appears and the ghost quiets, the game implies an answer. Yes, she knows now. But in the original, there is only the battle and the silence afterward. The ghost that fought for a child she couldn't save, dissipating without confirmation that the child survived. Without knowing if the sacrifice meant anything. That's not a children's story. That's just a story. Section 6. The Unknown, the Ruins of Alph and the Language that Predates Language. In the southern part of the Johto region, west of Violet City, there is a place that doesn't quite fit. Most of the Pokemon world is either natural, the forests, caves, mountains, oceans, or modern, the towns and cities where people live and trade and battle. But the ruins of Alph are neither. They're ancient, architecturally anomalous, built in a style that doesn't correspond to any other structure in the region, from materials that suggest a different era entirely, covered in symbols that no character in the game can fully explain. The symbols are the unknown. 28 distinct varieties of a Pokemon that looks unlike almost any other Pokemon. Each one is flat, black, and shaped like a letter of the Latin alphabet, plus punctuation. They have a single eye. They float. They have been found in the ruins since anyone can remember. And no one, in the 30 years since they were introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver in 1999, has fully explained what they are. The Pokédex entries for unknown are strange in ways that compound over time. They describe an ancient creature. They say that it is unknown which came first, the unknown or human writing. They note that unknown have been discovered in ruins across multiple regions, not just the ruins of Alph and Johto, but similar sites in Sinnoh, in the Sevi Islands, in archaeological locations spread across what appears to be the entire Pokemon world. They describe the unknown as having a power, a collective power, when many gather, that can alter reality itself. This last point is established most dramatically in Pokemon, the movie 3 subtitled Spell of the Unknown. In that film, a child's intense grief summons the unknown to create an entirely physical manifestation of her imagination. A crystalline tower, a fabricated entity who believes itself to be real, an alternate reality constructed from sorrow. The unknown in the film are not explained or understood by any character. They simply respond to the emotional intensity of the moment and build something from it. They are a force that takes shape from thought and feeling, an ancient power that has no purpose except to manifest what is asked of it. This capacity makes them remarkable in the context of the broader franchise mythology. Most legendary Pokemon have defined roles. Dialga governs time. Kyogre shapes the sea. Rayquaza maintains the sky. The Unknown's role is undefined. They are older than nearly anything else in the Pokemon world's history, present in ruins that predate recorded civilization. And yet they do not appear to maintain anything. They don't guard a location. They don't control a natural force. They exist in the ruins, and they respond to intention. And their relationship to the writing systems of the regions where they're found is left deliberately ambiguous. The ambiguity has a specific shape. In the ruins of Alph, after the player solves a series of sliding tile puzzles, revealing images of legendary Pokemon, Kabuto, Aerodactyl, Ho-Oh, Omanite. The walls of hidden chambers reveal inscriptions in the unknown alphabet. These inscriptions can be translated. The hidden text in the original Gold and Silver reads, in part, "They possess power to sense with mind and reject outside." In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, expanded inscriptions were added. When gathered, their power grows beyond any measure. Another chamber reads, "Light and dark, the two make up the world as one." These phrases are not decorative. They're not flavor text in the way that Pokédex entries sometimes are. They're instructions, or histories, or warnings, something left behind by whoever built the ruins. And whoever built the ruins knew about the unknown in an intimate way that no living character in the games appears to. The question of who built the ruins of Alph connects to a larger question about the Pokemon world's ancient history that the franchise has been slowly building towards since the second generation. Similar ruins exist in Sinnoh, the Salatian ruins, which also contain unknown writing and slide puzzles revealing legendary Pokemon. Similar ruins exist in the Sevi Islands. The Sinjoh ruins, accessible only through a special event in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where you bring an Arceus to the ruins of Alph and trigger a teleportation event combine architectural elements of both Johto and Sinnoh in a single location, suggesting a cultural connection between the two regions that predates the formation of either one as we know it. The theory that has emerged from these details across the community is that the Pokemon world's ancient history involved a civilization, or multiple related civilizations, that had direct contact with the unknown. That these people understood the unknown not as wild creatures to be caught and trained, but as entities with cosmological significance. That they built their sacred sites in locations where unknown gathered, incorporated the creatures' letter forms into their written language, and documented their understanding of reality through inscriptions that have survived millennia. This would also explain a passage in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl that has been noted by lore enthusiasts. A hiker, NPC in Sinnoh, tells the player, seemingly offhand, that all Pokemon are fragments of Arceus. That when Arceus created the world, pieces of itself became the individual creatures that populate it. This theory, delivered by a random character with no special narrative significance, is almost certainly not random. In a franchise as carefully constructed as Pokemon, where every detail of lore is considered by a dedicated writing team, a throwaway line from a hiker stating that every Pokemon is a piece of the world's creator carries enormous weight if you're paying attention. And if that's true, if every Pokemon is a fragment of Arceus, then what does that make the unknown, who predate recorded history and whose writing appears at the sacred sites of ancient civilizations, and who have the power to reshape reality when they gather in sufficient numbers? What does it mean that their forms are the forms of letters, the shapes that intelligent beings use to record thought and communicate across time? The unsolved aspect of the unknown is not just the question of who created the ruins, or whether the ancient civilizations used unknown writing, or whether unknown writing evolved independently to match the ancient script. The deeper unsolved question is what the unknown actually are in relation to the franchise's fundamental cosmology. They're not simply glyphs come to life. They're not just another species of wild Pokemon. They appear in every region where ancient ruins exist. They respond to human emotion and intention. Their inscriptions appear to carry genuine information about the nature of reality in the Pokemon world. And then there's this, which is perhaps the strangest detail of all. In the original Gold and Silver, the Unknown Report, a document the player receives that records every form of Unknown encountered, has space for 26 forms, corresponding to the 26 letters of the Latin alphabet. The game was made in Japan. The Pokemon world does not appear to use Latin script as its primary written language. Visible text in the games tends to use a stylized in-universe alphabet. The decision to make the Unknown correspond to the Latin alphabet rather than to Japanese kana or the in-universe script was deliberate. It was made so that players could decode the inscriptions directly, but it also creates a question that no one in the games ever asks. Why do these ancient ruins, built by a civilization that predates modern Johto, contain writing in an alphabet that looks exactly like the one used by players in the real world? The easy answer is that it's a game design choice for playability. But the interesting answer, the one that sits at the edge of the franchise's willingness to engage with its own mythology, is that maybe the Unknown didn't take their shapes from human writing. Maybe human writing, in some universe where the Pokemon world and our own are adjacent, took its shapes from the unknown, which would mean that every time a person writes a letter, they're tracing the outline of something ancient, something that gathers in ruins and responds to thought, something whose nature no one fully understands. The ruins of Alph still standing, still full of inscriptions, still attracting researchers who come and find more questions than answers. The radio frequency question is worth spending a moment on because it goes to the heart of what makes the unknown mysterious in a way that isn't just narrative speculation. In the original Pokemon Crystal, the third game set in Johto, the Pokemon radio, which plays throughout the overworld via the Pokegear, can be tuned to a specific frequency when the player is standing within the ruins of Alph. At that frequency, they hear something that isn't music. It's a broadcast from inside the ruins, a transmission on a channel that no one appears to be sending, a sound with no identifiable source. Players have analyzed it, recorded it, tried to decode it. The most common interpretation is that it's generated by the unknown themselves. That a gathering of unknown produces a detectable signal in the electromagnetic spectrum, something that a radio receiver can pick up as sound. This detail received no explanation in the game. It was simply present. A frequency on the radio dial that played a sound from the ruins. And then subsequent games, the remakes and the sequels, quietly removed it or changed it. The original Crystal has this feature. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which are otherwise extraordinarily thorough in expanding on the lore of the ruins, do not include it in the same way. So there was a radio signal coming from the ruins, generated apparently by beings whose nature no one in the game's world fully understands. And then, in subsequent versions, it was quietly changed or removed. Not explained, just altered. The franchise's relationship with the unknown is characterized by this pattern. Details introduced, questions raised, follow-up partial or absent. There are more unknown forms than 26. In Pokemon Gold and Silver, only the 26 alphabetic forms existed. In Crystal, 2 additional forms, the exclamation point and the question mark, were added. Future games have used these forms in specific puzzle contexts, suggesting they have distinct significance from the alphabetic forms. But what that significance is exactly has never been stated clearly. They punctuate something. But what? The unknown remain at the center of the Pokemon world's mythology and at the edge of its answers. After nearly 30 years, their full nature is still the franchise's most carefully maintained blank space. Section 7. The GS Ball. The biggest drop thread in anime history. There are mysteries that exist because no one knows the answer. And then there are mysteries that exist because the answer was deliberately buried. The GS Ball is the second kind. We know what it was supposed to be. We know why the plan changed. We know that the people who made the decision hoped, specifically, that the audience would forget. They didn't. The GS Ball enters the Pokemon anime at the beginning of the Orange Islands arc, presented to Ash by Professor Oak as an errand, a favor to a colleague. He needs Ash to retrieve a mysterious Pokeball from Professor Ivy in Valencia Island and bring it back to Pallet Town. It's a small request folded into the beginning of a major story arc. When Ash arrives and receives the ball, the mystery deepens almost immediately. The GS Ball is gold on top and silver on the bottom, engraved with the letters G and S on its face. It cannot be opened. It cannot be transported using standard Pokemon transportation technology. When placed in a transporter, it fails to materialize at the destination. It has to be hand-carried. Nobody knows why. This is played as a significant mystery. The show emphasizes the ball's unusual properties across multiple episodes. Professor Ivy, one of the most respected Pokemon researchers in the anime's world, was completely unable to determine what the ball was or what it contained after extended study. Professor Oak, upon receiving it from Ash at the end of the Orange Islands arc, is similarly stumped. He eventually asks Ash to carry it all the way to Johto and deliver it to Kurt, a Pokeball craftsman who lives in Azalea Town and is considered one of the foremost experts on Pokeball construction and history in the world. Ash delivers the ball to Kurt at the midpoint of the Johto arc. Kurt takes it for analysis. And then, within the next episode, the GS Ball is mentioned to Professor Oak in passing, confirmed as delivered, and never spoken of again. For the remaining 100-plus episodes of the Johto series, across multiple regions and story arcs and years of broadcast time, no one ever mentions the GS ball. Kurt never reports back. The ball's contents are never revealed. The mystery that was presented as a driving narrative thread simply evaporates. The explanation, when it emerged publicly, came from Masamitsu Hidaka in a 2008 interview, 8 years after the mystery was quietly buried, and in response to a question from a fan site interviewer who still wanted to know. Hidaka confirmed that the GS ball was intended to contain Celebi. The plan, as originally structured, was for the Johto arc to include a major storyline in which the GS ball was opened, and Celebi, the mythical time travel Pokemon, was revealed and became a traveling companion for Ash and his friends for a significant portion of the season. This plan was scrapped when the production team decided that Celebi would appear in the 4th Pokemon film instead. The movie Pokemon Forever, Celebi, Voice of the Forest, was being developed concurrently with the Johto anime arc. Having Celebi appear in both a major anime arc and a theatrical film in the same period felt redundant to the decision-makers. So the anime's Celebi storyline was abandoned. The GS ball, which had been introduced specifically to set up that storyline, suddenly had no purpose. And rather than create a new storyline around it, the writers made the call to simply hand it to Kurt and move on. Hidaka's exact words, as they've been translated and reported, were something to the effect that they hoped viewers would eventually forget about the GS ball. They did not. Fans have been asking about it ever since. It appears on lists of the greatest dropped plot threads in anime history. It is cited regularly as evidence that the Pokemon anime's storytelling process, particularly in the Johto era, was insufficiently planned and too reactive to commercial considerations. What's interesting is that the GS ball mystery has a shadow in the games. In the original Japanese version of Pokemon Crystal, the GS ball was an event item obtainable through the Pokemon Mobile System GB, a paid cellular network service available only in Japan in 2001. Players who obtained it could take it to Kurt, who would analyze it and eventually return it. If the player then brought it to the Alex Forest Shrine, placing it at the base of the shrine would cause Celebi to appear, the only legitimate way to obtain Celebi in that game. The event was never made available outside Japan. In Pokemon Adventures, the manga series that runs parallel to the games, and is often considered significantly darker and more narratively satisfying, the GS ball receives a full explanation. It's a Pokeball constructed specifically to capture time, and Celebi in particular, built from the rainbow feathers of Ho-Oh and the silver feathers of Lugia. The gold and silver of its name refer literally to those two legendary birds. The villain of the manga's Gold, Silver, and Crystal arc, the masked man who is eventually revealed as the gym leader Price, spends the entire arc trying to create a GS ball to capture Celebi and use its time travel abilities for his own ends. It's a complete, satisfying story. The anime never got there. The ball sits with Kurt, presumably, in the continuity of the original series. Never opened. Never explained. The Celebi it was built around appeared in a movie instead, in a different storyline, with no connection to the ball or to Ash's Johto journey. The mystery is technically solved. We know what was in it. But the anime itself never resolved it, which means that within the world of the show, as experienced by its audience, the GS ball remains exactly what it always was. An unanswered question, handed off to a craftsman in a small town in Johto and never mentioned again. There is something almost melancholy about that. Not just because it's a dropped thread, but because of what it represents about the nature of the anime's storytelling. The Johto arc is, by most assessments, the Pokemon anime's most problematic era. A long, sprawling series of episodes that often felt like it was spinning its wheels, returning to familiar dynamics and familiar conflicts without progressing toward any clear destination. The GS ball, if the Celebi arc had been executed, might have given that era a genuine center of gravity, a mystery that built towards something. Instead, the mystery was introduced, carried across 2 regions, and then quietly set down in the hands of a minor character while the show moved on. The Pokemon anime eventually found its footing in later series. But the GS ball remains in Azalea Town, and Kurt has never called. There's also something interesting about the ball itself as an object, independent of its contents. The GS ball is gold on top and silver on the bottom. Its name references the Pokemon Gold and Silver games. It was introduced at the beginning of the arc that would take Ash through the Gold and Silver region. If the design intent was for the ball to connect to those games specifically, to serve as a through line between the game's event content and the anime's storyline, then the scrapping of that plan left an orphaned symbol in the middle of the narrative. The gold and silver colors, the G and S engraving, these mean nothing in the anime's continuity. They were designed to mean something. The object outlasted its purpose. In a strange way, the GS ball's history makes it a more interesting narrative artifact than it would have been if the Celebi arc had been completed. Had the plan been executed, the ball would have been opened, its contents revealed, and the story would have moved on. Instead, it sits with Kurt, sealed and unexplained, a permanent monument to a plan that was made and then quietly abandoned because something shinier, a theatrical film, a larger commercial opportunity, came along and took what was supposed to be inside it. The franchise's commercial reality and its storytelling ambitions have always existed in tension. The GS ball is simply a very clear illustration of what happens when the commercial wins. Section 8, Lost Silver and the Haunted Cartridge Mythology. Before we go further, if you've been enjoying this so far, now is the perfect time to subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment, let me know what mystery has hit closest to home tonight, and we'll keep going. There's a genre of story that emerged from the early years of internet culture, built around a specific anxiety that anyone who grew up in the age of cartridge games will recognize. The anxiety is about the physical object, the little gray or yellow or blue plastic shell that held your entire world. All your Pokemon, all your progress, all your hours. In a battery-backed memory chip the size of your thumbnail. The battery could die. The save file could corrupt. The game could be erased by a lightning strike, by dropping the cartridge, by one bad connection in the slot. And if you bought a used cartridge, which many children did, because new cartridges were expensive and the GameStop used bin was right there, you might find a save file left by a stranger. An unknown person who played before you, who made choices you didn't make, who named their trainer something that wasn't your name, and trained Pokemon you wouldn't have trained, and left their mark on the cartridge you were now holding. These anxieties became the foundation of what are called haunted game creepypastas. And Pokemon, because of its themes of bonding and loss and death, and the literal burial ground at the center of its first game, was fertile ground for them. The most celebrated of these stories is called Lost Silver, and while it is entirely fictional, its unknown author posted it anonymously on 4chan in June 2010, and the story spread from there. It draws on elements of the actual Pokemon Gold and Silver games with a precision that makes it genuinely unsettling for anyone who knows those games well. The story is written in first person, as these things always are. The narrator is a college student waiting for Pokemon Soul Silver to arrive from Amazon and passing the time by buying a used copy of the original Silver from GameStop. The cart starts up, but not as it should. It freezes on the Game Freak logo, then finally loads not to a title screen, but directly into a save file. The trainer is named with ellipses, just 3 dots. The Pokédex is fully complete. all 251 entries. The time logged on the file is 999 hours and 59 minutes, the maximum the game can display. The money is maxed out. The party consists of 5 unknown and a Cyndaquil named Hurry. None of the Pokemon's cries play when you check their status screens, just silence. From there, the story moves through a series of increasingly disturbing sequences. The trainer appears in Bellsprout Tower, but a version of it with no exits, no NPCs, no movement. Using Flash, an HM that normally brightens dark caves, causes the room to fill with an unnatural red light. The Cyndaquil named Hurry, who is described as having the appearance of a normal Cyndaquil, but the unease of something wrong, faints not in the usual animation but in a way that the story describes as permanent death. The unknown in the party spell out words as you proceed. Leave. Heeded. Dying. No more. The trainer's sprite changes. Arms disappear, then legs. The figure becomes progressively less human. At the story's conclusion, the protagonist finds themselves standing among a field of graves, surrounded by Pokemon headstones, in a silent version of a space that might be the final resting place of a trainer who never stopped playing, who reached the theoretical maximum of the game and found nothing there but darkness. The story works for several reasons, some of which are practical and some of which are more interesting. The practical reason is that everything it describes is within the technical possibility of the actual game. Pokemon Gold and Silver do contain unknown. The unknown's letters can form words. Flash does exist as an HM. Bellsprout Tower is a real location. The haunted cartridge framework, someone else's save file, the peculiarities of a used game, is immediately legible to anyone who has bought used games. The story uses the real architecture of the game as the scaffolding for its horror, which makes it feel like something that could have actually happened to the narrator rather than something invented. The more interesting reason is what the story does thematically. Lost Silver is at its core a story about completion and death. The trainer named with ellipses has done everything, caught every Pokemon, logged a lifetime of hours, accumulated every possible resource, and none of it saved them. The suggestion is that this person played Pokemon for years, perhaps to the exclusion of other things, perhaps as a way of avoiding the reality of mortality, and that the game itself has become a kind of afterlife for them, or a record of the emptiness at the end of achievement. The unknown don't just spell out scary words. They spell out the commentary of a game that was designed to be caught and completed, now being inhabited by someone for whom the game became the whole world. This reading gives the story an emotional weight that pure horror usually lacks. It's not just scary, it's sad. The horror of Lost Silver is not the jump scares or the corrupted graphics. It's the image of someone who played for 999 hours and found the end of the game and kept going anyway, because there was nothing outside the game to go back to. The story inspired a fan game, built from scratch, to visualize the narrative as it was described. The fan game has been expanded and updated over the years, adding new routes and endings and hidden content. It has a dedicated fan base. People still discover it for the first time and have the experience the original story was trying to create. The anonymous author released additional chapters of the story years after the original posting, suggesting new layers to the mystery and confirming that the haunted cartridge was not simply a hacked game, but something that could not be fully explained. None of it is real, of course. Used Pokemon cartridges do not harbor the spirits of dead trainers. Unknown cannot be arranged by supernatural means. The 999-hour save file is not a monument to anything, but the fear that these things touch. The fear that the games we love might hold something we're not supposed to find. That the batteries that keep our save files alive might someday reveal a truth we're not ready for. That fear is real. And Lost Silver, like all the best fiction, uses something real to build towards something that doesn't need to be literally true in order to be true enough. There were many stories like this. Black, a creepypasta about a hacked Pokemon Red cartridge that forced opponents' Pokemon to use a move called Curse that wasn't in any real Pokemon game. A move that caused them to die permanently rather than faint, leaving behind ghost representations that followed the player's team. The description of the ghosts traveling behind your party in silence, growing more numerous as you battled more and more, accumulating the dead. It was genuinely affecting in a way that few pieces of fan fiction managed to be. Strangest House on Mount Silver, also known as Snow on Mount. Silver described a mysterious figure that appeared at the top of the mountain in a hacked silver cartridge. A figure who stood in the snow without a name or a Pokédex entry, and who, when battled, would simply respond with his presence until the music faded and the screen went dark. Widely analyzed as a meditation on Red, the protagonist of the first generation, and what it would mean to be a champion who has run out of challenges, who has been to the top of every mountain and beaten every trainer, and has nothing left to do but stand in the snow. These stories are all fiction, but they emerged from the same instinct that drives all mythology: the need to explain the inexplicable. The feeling that a place or a thing means more than it appears to mean. The refusal to accept that the games were only games, that the creatures were only code, that the hours spent with them were spent in a closed world with no mysteries left to find. There's a subset of the haunted cartridge mythology that's worth acknowledging specifically. The stories that aren't quite creepypastas, that sit in a different register. Not horror stories told for the pleasure of being scared, but genuine accounts of strange experiences with old game cartridges. The save file corruption stories. The cartridges that showed Pokemon who had been named by previous owners, who were at unexpectedly high levels, who had movesets that made no sense for their development history. The file that showed a maxed out game from someone who clearly played for hundreds of hours, and the strange mixture of reverence and unsettlement that came from inheriting that. Used cartridges carry their previous owners in them. The Pokemon inside have names the current owner didn't give them. They were raised by someone else's choices, trained through someone else's journey, kept in a box while their trainer moved on to newer games, or newer systems, or simply away from Pokemon entirely. When you inherit a used cartridge, you're not starting from zero. You're starting from the middle of someone else's story, and that someone is entirely absent. You can see the evidence of their choices, but not them. The haunted game creepypastas are exaggerations of this entirely real and somewhat melancholy experience. The thing that happens when you boot up a used Pokemon game and see someone else's name, someone else's team, someone else's hundreds of hours already lived, that experience has a weight to it that is not supernatural, but is genuinely strange. You are holding a kind of record of a relationship, a record of affection. Someone cared enough about these fictional creatures to give them nicknames and level them up and teach them particular moves and carry them through a game. And then they're gone, and the Pokemon are still there in the box, waiting. Lost Silver understands this. The horror in that story isn't the scrambled sprites or the messages spelled in unknown. The horror is the 999-hour save file, the complete Pokédex, the maxed money and maxed time. The evidence of a complete devotion that has no one on the other end of it anymore. That's the thing that makes you set the cartridge down and look at it differently. Not a ghost, just absence. Section 9, the Arceus creation myth, Giratina's exile, and the cosmology that the games keep expanding. Pokemon has a creation myth. This is not widely appreciated outside the dedicated fandom, partly because it was introduced gradually across multiple games and generations, and partly because the franchise's public-facing identity, the colorful cartoon, the trading cards, the catch-them-all marketing, doesn't naturally suggest the kind of cosmological depth that the lore has quietly accumulated. The creation myth lives primarily in the Sinnoh region. Introduced in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl in 2006 and 2007, and significantly expanded in Pokemon Platinum in 2008, and then again in Pokemon Legends Arceus in 2022. It is a story about the origin of everything, told in fragments across Pokédex entries, environmental text, NPC dialogue, and the implicit structure of the region's geography. It has been compared by people who study these things to the creation myths of real-world cultures, specifically the kind of creation myths that describe a single originating consciousness differentiating itself into the components of a universe. In the beginning there was nothing. Then from nothing an egg appeared, and from the egg a single creature emerged. The games call this creature Arceus. The ancient people of the Sinnoh region called it Almighty Sinnoh, and their descendants still use that name. Arceus is described in its Pokédex entries as the first Pokemon, the one who hatched from the egg and then created everything else. From Arceus, 3 other creatures were made, simultaneously, at the moment the universe began to take shape. Their names are Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. Each was given control over a fundamental aspect of reality. Dialga governs time, Palkia governs space, and Giratina governs antimatter, the inverse of matter, the shadow substance that makes the universe's balance possible. When Dialga came into being, time began to pass. When Palkia came into being, space expanded, and Giratina, the antimatter deity, was given governance over the distortion world, a parallel dimension where time does not flow and space is unstable, a place that exists as the necessary counterpart to the organized universe that Dialga and Palkia shaped. Then Giratina was banished to that world. This is the part that the games do not fully explain, and it is the part that has generated the most sustained speculation in the fandom's history. The official account of Giratina's banishment is that it was exiled due to its violent nature. Arceus, having created the universe through Dialga and Palkia, found that the third deity, the one governing antimatter, was too destructive to be permitted in the world it had helped create. Giratina was sent to the distortion world permanently, condemned to watch the universe it helped bring into being from a dimension on the other side of everything. But what does that mean? What did Giratina do? The games never say. The fragments of the Sinnoh creation myth recorded in the Canalave library, the archives of ancient legend that players can read in the games, describe the events without specifying the violence. A researcher named Cynthia, the Sinnoh champion, has studied the myths extensively and offers some interpretation, but even her most detailed analysis acknowledges enormous gaps. What Legends Arceus added to this in 2022 was a layer of motive. The game is set in the ancient past of what will become the Sinnoh region, when it was still called Hisui, and a significant portion of its endgame involves a character named Volo, a descendant of the ancient builders of the ruins throughout the region, who seeks to recreate the conditions of Arceus' arrival in order to ask it a question. His question is, essentially, why did you make the world this way? Why did you create beings capable of suffering? What was the purpose of making a universe that contains tragedy? This is not a question that most video game narratives engage with. The fact that it's posed here, explicitly, as the driving motivation of the game's antagonist, suggests that the franchise has been thinking about the theological implications of its own creation myth for some time. Volo's frustration is not with Arceus specifically, it's with the nature of existence itself. He has found the fragments of the story of Giratina's banishment, has understood that the universe was created with something fundamentally unjust in it from the beginning, and has concluded that this injustice should be undone. The mystery of why Giratina was banished connects to a question that the creation myth raises but has never answered. What is the relationship between Arceus and the world it created? The Pokédex entries describe Arceus as a guy, the creator, the origin, the being that shaped everything. But Legends Arceus presents a more ambiguous figure. Arceus in that game is not omnipotent in the way a supreme deity in most theological traditions would be. It was wounded by a meteor and required human help to survive. Its plans can be frustrated by other forces. It banished Giratina, but Giratina survived the banishment and continues to exist, continues to hold a grudge, continues to work against its creator through intermediaries. This is the profile not of an all-powerful god, but of a very powerful being operating in a universe that sometimes pushes back. A being that made choices, including the choice to create 3 deities and then exile one of them, and has lived with the consequences of those choices, a being that may have made mistakes. This makes Arceus, paradoxically, more interesting as a mythological figure than a simpler omnipotent creator would be. And it makes Giratina more interesting too. Giratina is not simply the villain of the Sinnoh mythology. It's the exiled one, the banished third, the antimatter deity condemned to a dimensionality without time or space, who has spent the entirety of recorded history in the distortion world watching the universe it helped create from the wrong side of a mirror. Its rage, when it manifests in the games, is not mindless. It has a direction. It points at Arceus. But Arceus, in Legends Arceus, does not destroy Giratina for its continued defiance. It does not re-exile it. It does not punish the player for interfering with Giratina's schemes. It seems, if anything, to accept Giratina's existence as part of the universe's structure, as a necessary element that cannot simply be removed without consequences. What was Giratina's violence in the beginning? What did it do that earned eternal exile? Was the banishment just? Is Arceus the benevolent creator the ancient people of Sinnoh worshipped, or something more complex? A being that made the world and also made a decision that condemns 1/3 of its own creation to permanent separation. There is one more piece of this that players who have spent time with the Sinnoh mythology tend to arrive at eventually. The 3 components of the creation trio, time, space, and antimatter, are not a natural grouping in the way that, say, the weather trio or the legendary birds are. Time and space make obvious sense together as the dimensions of physical reality, but antimatter is different. Antimatter is not a dimension. It's the shadow of matter, the substance that, when it meets matter, produces annihilation. In particle physics terms, when matter and antimatter collide, both cease to exist. Equal and opposite destruction. This makes Giratina's domain uniquely dangerous in a way that Dialga's and Palkia's simply aren't. The misuse of time or space, bending them, slowing them, distorting them, is disruptive, potentially catastrophic. But it doesn't produce annihilation. Antimatter, by definition, does. The banished deity controls the substance that destroys existence on contact. And it's been sitting in the distortion world for the entirety of recorded history, holding a grudge against the creator that exiled it. The question of whether the banishment was just is also, therefore, a question of risk assessment. Whatever Giratina did in the beginning, keeping it separate from the matter-composed universe it helped to create was also the safest possible arrangement given what it governs. Whether Arceus understood this and made the banishment as a practical decision rather than a moral one, whether the exile was mercy rather than punishment, is something the games have raised and never answered, and it might be the most important unsolved question in the entire franchise's mythology. The games keep returning to these questions. They keep adding fragments. Every generation adds something to the cosmological picture. Another piece of the origin story that was always bigger than any individual game could contain. And the mystery at the center, the nature of Arceus, the reason for Giratina's banishment, the question of whether the universe was made well, remains. It's a remarkably ambitious set of questions to embed in a franchise about catching creatures in red and white balls. But perhaps this is exactly the point. The Pokemon franchise has always operated on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is exactly what it appears to be: a cheerful adventure about a child and their animal companions, exploring a world full of wonder and competition. But underneath that surface, if you choose to look, if you read the Pokédex entries, if you talk to every NPC, if you notice the inscriptions on the ruined walls and the hiker's throwaway line about all Pokémon being fragments of a creator, there is a completely different franchise. One grappling with questions about origin and purpose and the nature of consciousness and what it means to create something that can suffer. The Lake Guardians add another layer to this. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, the three legendary Pokemon who reside in Sinnoh's lakes, are described in the game's mythology as having given humanity its mind. Uxie bestowed knowledge. Mesprit bestowed emotion. Azelf bestowed willpower. The combination of knowledge, emotion, and willpower is what the franchise presents as the foundation of human consciousness. These three aspects, drawn from three separate beings and combined in humans, are what separate people from other creatures in the Pokemon world. This is an extraordinarily rich piece of creation mythology for a children's franchise. The idea that human consciousness was not inherent, not simply the product of evolution, but was given by creatures who chose to gift it, who distributed the components of mind across three separate entities so that no single being could hold all of it at once. The restraint in that design, if the mythology is read as intended, is remarkable. Wisdom, feeling, and drive distributed separately, requiring integration in a single person to produce the capacity for thought and choice that humans have. The franchise leaves this without elaboration, as it leaves most things. The lakes are there. The three legendary Pokemon can be caught. Their Pokédex entries describe their mythological significance, and the implication that humanity as the games depict it was made, was given, received something from outside itself, is simply present, never confirmed, never denied, never developed into a storyline that would force the franchise to commit to what it means. Arceus made the cosmos. The Lake Guardians made the human mind. And what Arceus made the cosmos for, and whether the minds that were made have the capacity to understand it, remain the open questions at the center of the deepest Pokemon mythology there is. Section 10. The Dark Pokédex, Unsolved Lore, and the Mysteries that are still waiting. We're in the late hours now. The world is quiet. Let's move through the last of the mysteries. The ones that don't have a single story to tell, but that accumulate detail by detail into a portrait of a franchise that is stranger and darker at its edges than anyone expected it to be when it launched in 1996 as a game about children collecting animals. The Pokédex is the most reliable source of darkness in Pokemon. It is presented as a scientific instrument, an encyclopedia compiled from observations, a record maintained by a young trainer as they encounter new creatures for the first time. But the entries it contains are, across 30 years and hundreds of Pokemon, often genuinely disturbing in a way that seems impossible to explain as either accident or simple dramatic flair. They read like dispatches from a world where horror is mundane, where the existence of creatures with destructive or predatory or simply inexplicable properties is just a fact of nature, documented without alarm. Drifloon is a floating balloon-shaped ghost type, pink and cheerful-looking. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a Pokémon that grabs the hands of small children and attempts to drag them to the afterlife. The entry from Heart Gold and Soul Silver reads that any child who mistakes it for a balloon could wind up missing. The Sun entry specifies that it dislikes heavy children, which implies a preference for lighter ones, which implies judgment, which implies a predatory cognition that the creature's appearance as a goofy balloon absolutely does not suggest. Yamask, introduced in Pokemon Black and White, carries a mask with it at all times. The mask, according to its Pokédex entries, is the face it had when it was alive. When it looks at the face, it weeps. This implies being the games never state it explicitly, but the implication is unavoidable that Yamask was once a human being, not a Pokemon. A person who died and, through some mechanism the games never explain, became a Pokemon, carrying its own face, crying when it looks at what it used to be. Gengar, one of the original 151 and one of the franchise's most iconic Pokemon, has entries across multiple generations that describe it lurking in shadows, waiting in dark rooms, specifically targeting people who are lost or alone and feel a sudden chill. The entries suggest that the chill is Gengar approaching, that the sense of being watched in a dark room is not imagination. Several of Gengar's entries note that it was originally a human, the same implication as Yamask, stretched over decades of Pokédex writing for a Pokemon introduced in the franchise's very first generation. One of the most recognizable creatures in Pokemon history, it turns out, may be the ghost of a person. There is a theory, never confirmed, never explicitly denied, that a significant proportion of ghost-type Pokemon are the spirits of humans who died, and in the Pokemon world's equivalent of an afterlife, became Pokemon instead of simply departing. This would explain the number of ghost types whose entries describe them as having had faces, having had feelings, having carried memories of a previous existence. It would explain why ghost-type Pokemon uniquely have such a high rate of entries describing behaviors that seem emotionally complex. Grief, loneliness, attachment, predation that seems personal rather than simply instinctive. It would give the entire ghost-type category a coherent mythology. Game Freak has never confirmed this. The question of what happens when a Pokemon, or a person, dies in the Pokemon world is one the franchise has been consistently unwilling to address directly. Mr. Fuji, who appears in Lavender Town and who has a history with the creation of Mewtwo, mentions in passing that he has been researching Pokemon death, but the research is never described and the results are never shared. The tower full of graves in Lavender Town was, in the second generation, converted into a radio tower. The graves were relocated, the building repurposed, the monument to Pokemon death turned into a communications hub. Some fans read this as a statement about human relationships with mortality. We build memorials, and then we build over them. The question of what actually happens to Pokemon when they die is one of the most carefully avoided questions in the franchise's history. The games show you Pokemon fainting. They show you Pokemon recovering at Pokemon centers. They show you Pokemon graves. But the space between those facts is where the interesting territory lies, and Game Freak has never mapped it. There are other unsolved threads. The identity of Ash's father, never addressed in 20-plus years of the anime, despite the fact that both Ash's father and grandfather are mentioned in the first few episodes as having left on Pokemon journeys and never returned. The question of whether they are dead or simply traveling, or whether one of them might be a recognizable character in the anime's cast, has been raised and never answered. The show ended Ash's main story without addressing it. The matter of what Professor Ivy did to Brock. During the Orange Islands arc, Brock stays behind with Professor Ivy and is absent from the story for an extended period. When he returns, his personality has visibly changed. Any mention of Professor Ivy causes him to flinch, curl in on himself, and weakly ask for the subject to be dropped. Whatever happened on Valencia Island disturbed him profoundly enough to alter his fundamental demeanor. The anime never addressed this. Presumably the writers introduced it as a comedic running gag and then lost interest in it. But the gap it leaves The thing that happened that cannot be spoken has the texture of a genuine mystery. The matter of Arcanine, which is described in its Pokédex entries as a legendary Pokémon. No other non-legendary Pokémon is described this way. Arcanine's entries call it a legendary creature from China, magnificent, the subject of ancient tales. In the very first episode of the anime, a wall carving is shown depicting a collection of legendary Pokémon, and Arcanine appears among them alongside Ho-Oh and Articuno and Zapdos. But Arcanine is not a legendary by the game's mechanical definition. It breeds normally, it appears in the wild, it's a standard Pokémon that evolves from Growlithe using a Firestone. The franchise has never explained why the Pokédex describes it as legendary or why it appears on what appears to be an ancient carving of deities. One theory suggests that Arcanine was originally intended to be one of the legendary birds, a fire-type counterpart to Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, before Moltres was designed and took that role. The carving in the anime episode might be a remnant of that earlier design intent, depicting the Pokémon world as it was conceived before the final legendary lineup was settled. If this is correct, Arcanine has been carrying the ghost of a destiny it was meant to have. Legendary status, inclusion in the pantheon of mythological creatures, without anyone ever formally taking it away. Its Pokédex entries still call it legendary. The ancient carving still includes it, and the franchise has never changed either. There is also the recurring question of the Pokémon War. Lieutenant Surge, the electric gym leader of Vermilion City, casually mentions in the original Red and Blue that electric Pokémon saved his life in the war. In a game that is otherwise completely cheerful and conflict-free, this single line implies that the world of Pokémon has experienced warfare, human warfare, fought with Pokémon as weapons or tools. The evidence is circumstantial, but has been extensively cataloged. The majority of adult men in Kanto are absent from the game's world, replaced by old men and children, and the occasional suspicious absence, where a father or uncle or neighbor should logically be. The number of hospitals in Kanto is unusually high relative to its size. Gym leaders of the appropriate age for military service are overwhelmingly female or otherwise notable exceptions. The inference, never confirmed, never denied, is that there was a war between the events of an earlier era and the events of the game, and that the men of an entire generation died in it. If this is true, it gives the seemingly cheerful world of Pokémon Red and Blue a hidden substrate of loss. A generation of children. The protagonist, the rival, the gym leader's children, the players themselves inhabiting the protagonist, who grew up without fathers, in a world still recovering from a conflict that is never named and never described. It would mean that the Pokémon you catch and train are not just companions in adventure, but potentially tools of war that were repurposed in the peace that followed for something more humane. It would mean that the warmth of the Pokémon world, the cheerfulness, the optimism, the fundamentally hopeful message about cooperation between humans and creatures, was earned at a cost that the games never fully enumerate. None of this is confirmed. The Pokémon War is a fan theory, built from Lieutenant Surge's offhand comment and demographic analysis of NPC populations. Game Freak has never verified it. But like the best fan theories, it explains things that otherwise don't have explanations. And once you've seen the shape of it, it becomes very difficult to unsee. Let's spend a moment with some of the other darker Pokédex entries that the franchise has produced without apparent concern over the years, because they deserve attention on their own terms. Not as building blocks of larger theories, but as individual things that are deeply strange. Hypno is a psychic type that looks like a drowsy, pendulum-swinging humanoid. Several of its Pokédex entries describe it as lurking near humans at night and using its swinging pendulum to hypnotize sleeping people and then taking them away. One entry specifies children. The XY entry says there have been cases of people being put to sleep by Hypno who were never seen again. In Pokemon Gold and Silver, there's an NPC in one of the towns who mentions that a young child has gone missing and that a Hypno was seen nearby. The child is never found in any gameplay sequence. The implication is simply left hanging. The child is gone, the Hypno is nearby, and the game moves on. Drowsy, the pre-evolution of Hypno, has entries that describe it as feeding on human dreams. Its nose supposedly itches when it's eating your dream. It prefers the dreams of children because children's dreams are tastier than adults. This is stated plainly, without alarm, in a children's game. Shedinja is a ghost contained within a discarded shell. When Nincada evolves into Ninjask, a second Pokemon appears in your party if you have room. Shedinja, the hollow shell left behind. Its single stat point and HP cannot be increased. Its ability Wonder Guard means that only attacks which it is theoretically weak to can damage it. All other attacks pass through it as if it isn't there. The Pokédex entries warn that looking into the hole in its back will steal your soul. Players are advised not to peer into it. Just that. Don't look. It has your soul if you do. Several entries across the franchise's history describe creatures whose very existence seems to create a problem for the otherwise optimistic framework of the games. Beware, introduced in the Sun and Moon games, is a bear-like normal/fighting type who is described as being incredibly affectionate, but whose hugs are strong enough to break the spine of anyone it embraces. Its entries note that it approaches humans from behind and suddenly embraces them with full force, and that trainers who are caught off guard are in danger of mortal injury. It loves to hug. The hugs kill people. This Pokemon is presented as a viable companion and gym obstacle. The Strange House in the Unova region contains a small subplot that players can discover if they read the books scattered throughout the abandoned building. A little girl used to live there. She was troubled by nightmares. Terrible, persistent nightmares that she described in diary entries found throughout the rooms. The entries suggest she sought a Cresselia's lunar wing, which is said to cure nightmares. She did not find one in time. She died. Her ghost still lives in the house. The Pokemon responsible for the nightmares, implied by the scattered evidence but never stated, is Darkrai. A legendary Pokemon that causes people who sleep near it to have unending nightmares and can trap them in dreams from which they never wake. The detail that makes this most unsettling is that it's entirely optional. The Strange House has no particular narrative significance in the main game. You don't have to read the diary entries. You don't have to piece together what happened. The mystery is there for the people who look, and it is dark in a way that is not softened or resolved. And then the game continues. What's notable about the Strange House is how it fits into a pattern that repeats across the franchise. The fragment of story placed just off the critical path, available only to players who choose to engage with it. The game doesn't reward you for finding it. There's no item behind the final diary entry, no NPC who congratulates you for piecing it together. The story is its own reward, if you find it worth having. Many players go through the Unova games and never encounter it at all. And the developers put it there anyway, put care and craft into the diary entries, into the architecture of the building, into the way the ghost NPC's dialogue shifts if you've read the full story versus if you haven't. This is what the best mysteries in the Pokemon franchise share. They don't demand to be found. They simply exist, fully formed, in corners of a world designed for players who are willing to look. The franchise has been doing this for 30 years. It will keep doing it. And somewhere in the game you've already played, in the corner you didn't visit, or the NPC you didn't talk to, or the Pokédex entry you scrolled past, there is almost certainly something still waiting. Go looking when you're ready. But for now, rest. There is a Pokemon in the Kalos region introduced in Pokemon X and Y called Az's Floette. AZ is a character in those games, a man who lived 3,000 years ago and who, when his Floette was killed in a war, built a machine to resurrect it using the life energy of other Pokemon as fuel. He brought his Floette back, but the Floette, learning what had been done to resurrect it, could not be with him and left. AZ spent 3,000 years searching. In the game's post-credits sequence, Floette is finally seen returning to AZ, and the implication is that they are reunited. This storyline has a loose thread that has never been addressed. The specific Floette in the story, Az's Floette, Eternal Flower Floette, a uniquely altered form of the species, was promised to players through an NPC in X and Y who hints that it would become obtainable through a future event. That event never happened. Eternal Flower Floette, as of the time of this recording, has never been legitimately distributed to any player in any country. It exists in the game's data. Its sprite is there. Its stats are programmed. It simply has never been given out. It has been nearly 15 years. The Pokemon Company has never explained why the distribution never occurred or whether it ever will. This makes Eternal Flower Floette one of the most poignant pieces of unreleased content in the franchise's history. Not because it's a particularly powerful Pokemon, but because the story it belongs to is specifically about waiting for something that left you. AZ waited 3,000 years for his Floette to return. Players have been waiting 15 years for the game to give them the Floette it promised. The parallel is presumably unintentional. It doesn't make it less meaningful. There's also the matter of Mimikyu, whose design has become iconic across merchandise and fan art. A small, unknown Pokemon hiding under a ragged cloth disguise designed to look like Pikachu. The reason for the disguise, according to Mimikyu's Pokédex entries, is that Mimikyu wants to be loved. It has spent decades studying Pikachu merchandise and fan materials and old anime footage so it could construct the best imitation possible. It is trying as hard as it can to look like the thing people love, because it has learned that it itself is not something people love. An entry in the Sun game notes that a scholar who tried to look beneath the disguise to see what was underneath died of shock. Another entry says Mimikyu's actual body is a dark, shadowy thing even it cannot understand. It inhabits the darkness beneath the cloth and ventures out wearing the shape of something beloved. This is not played for horror in the games. Mimikyu is presented as a companion, as a beloved Pokemon with a large fan base, which creates the somewhat vertiginous experience of a franchise fandom genuinely adoring a creature that exists in the fiction, specifically because it believes itself unworthy of love. The creature learned to disguise itself as the most beloved Pokemon in history because it understood that it would never be loved as itself. And then the audience fell in love with it. As itself, the creature in the disguise, not the disguise. There's something in that that's worth sitting with. An accidental piece of recursive warmth inside a story that was probably meant to be atmospheric and slightly sad. The mystery at the center of Mimikyu, what it looks like underneath the cloth, why seeing it causes mortal shock, is technically unsolved. But the emotional mystery at the center of its story, the question of whether something that believes it is unlovable can be loved anyway, was answered by the audience without the games needing to address it. This is, in the end, what all of these mysteries have in common. The Lavender Town theme that troubled an entire generation and gave birth to a legend. The truck that no one was supposed to find. The glitch that carries the cry of a Pokemon that never existed. The theory about two creatures sharing blood they were never supposed to share. The mother on the 6th floor who could not be caught. The ruins full of writing that predates writing. The ball that was carried across 2 regions and then quietly set down and never mentioned again. The haunted cartridge that taught a truth about completion and death. The creation myth with an exile at its center who has never explained what it did. The creature that wears a disguise to be loved. The Floette still waiting to be given to anyone. Each one is in its own way a gap, A place where the franchise gestures towards something larger than itself and then stops short of saying it. Whether that restraint is intentional, the careful construction of mystery for its own sake, the decision to leave space for imagination, or simply the natural byproduct of 30 years of an enormous franchise being made by changing teams with shifting priorities, the effect is the same. The world of Pokemon is larger than any game can contain. There are things in it that were never meant to be found, and things that were meant to be found but weren't finished, and things that were found and then buried, and things that were built as open questions and remain that way because the question is better than any answer. You can feel that when you walk into Lavender Town and the music changes. You can feel it in the silence on the eastern coast of Cinnabar Island. You can feel it in the moment you flip on the Sylph scope and the ghost on the 6th floor becomes something you recognize. You can feel it in the inscriptions on the walls of ruins that no one alive has fully deciphered, and in the radio frequency that plays in the ruins of Alph and comes from nowhere, and in the slot in the Pokemon Index that has a cry but no creature assigned to it. The game is bigger than you thought. It always was. The questions it leaves open are not failures of storytelling. They're invitations. Invitations to do what humans have always done with the mysterious. To look at the gap and imagine what lives inside it. To carry the questions with you as you fall asleep. And let them do what questions do best in the quiet hours. Turn them over, gently. There's no rush. Sleep well. The mysteries will be here when you wake up. If you made it all the way through tonight, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of video that takes a long time to research and write, and it means a lot that you were here for it. Drop a like if you enjoyed it. It helps more than you know. Subscribe if you haven't, because there's a lot more where this came from. And leave a comment telling me which mystery hit hardest tonight, or which one you were already thinking about before we even got there. Did you believe the truck held Mew when you were a kid? Did Lavender Town's theme keep you up? Did you ever encounter missing numbered on purpose or by accident and feel something strange about it? I want to know. Drop it in the comments. And for everyone watching this in the dark, in the quiet, in those late hours when the world gets its best thinking done, thank you for being here. Rest well. I'll see you in the next one.